The blistering sun of Muscle Beach beat down on a colossal 240-pound female bodybuilder who ruled the sands. Looking down at a 135-pound man, she scoffed, "You're tiny." She didn't know she was mocking Bruce Lee. Exactly 7 seconds later, the giantess was on her knees, begging for forgiveness. The year was 1968, and the relentless July sun was baking the golden shores of Santa Monica, California. This specific stretch of sand, affectionately and intimidatingly known as Muscle Beach, was not a place for the weak. It was a sun-drenched sanctuary for the genetically gifted, the chemically enhanced, and the obsessively dedicated. The air was thick with the scent of coconut tanning oil, salt spray, and raw, unfiltered sweat. The rhythmic clanking of rusted iron plates and the guttural grunts of massive human beings echoed over the crashing waves. At the absolute center of this testosterone-fueled ecosystem stood a woman who defied every conventional biological standard of the era. Her name was Beatrice Callahan, though everyone on the boardwalk simply called her B. B was a terrifying marvel of human architecture. Standing 6 feet and 2 inches in her bare feet, she walked around at a shredded, vascular 240 pounds. In an era where female bodybuilding was practically non-existent and largely frowned upon, B had carved herself out of granite through sheer, unrelenting willpower and a diet that would incapacitate a normal human. She possessed shoulders as wide as a barn door, a back that looked like a roadmap of knotted steel cables, and thighs that could crush watermelons with a casual flex. She was a pioneer, but she was also a tyrant. B ruled the beach through sheer intimidation. Beside her stood her trainer and fiancé, Sullivan Brooks, a heavily scarred former heavyweight boxer who tipped the scales at 280. Together, they were the undisputed king and queen of the iron. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, B was in the middle of a brutal set of heavy barbell curls. A crowd of around 50 people had formed a wide, respectful circle around her. Among them was Tommy Russo, a local powerlifter who usually commanded the crowd's attention. But even he stood back in silent awe as B curled 180 pounds with a fierce, vein-popping grimace. She thrived on the attention. She fed on the fear and admiration of the onlookers. For B, mass was the ultimate equalizer. Size was the only currency that mattered. Just beyond the periphery of B's devoted audience, 2 men were taking a quiet, unassuming stroll down the boardwalk. One was Harrison Miller, a local stuntman and aspiring martial arts instructor. Walking beside him was a man who, at first glance, seemed entirely unremarkable in this land of giants. He stood 5 feet, 7 inches tall, and weighed a modest 135 pounds. He wore a crisp, white-ribbed tank top, loose-fitting dark slacks, and a pair of classic tortoiseshell sunglasses. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets. He moved with a strange, liquid grace, his steps completely silent on the wooden planks of the boardwalk. This was Bruce Lee. At this point in time, Bruce was beginning to formulate the revolutionary concepts of Jeet Kune Do. He was moving away from the rigid, traditional styles of his past and obsessively studying the physics of human combat, fencing, Western boxing, and biomechanics. While the men and women of Muscle Beach worshipped static mass, Bruce worshipped explosive velocity. He understood that force was not simply about how much weight you carried, but the speed at which you could deliver it. "Look at the size of her, Bruce," Harrison muttered, nodding toward the massive crowd gathered around B. "I heard she benched 300 pounds yesterday. Nobody messes with her. Not even the local biker gangs." Bruce didn't break his stride, though he turned his head slightly, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses. "Muscle is just an engine," Bruce replied softly, his voice carrying a calm, philosophical cadence. A large engine is impressive to look at, but if the chassis is stiff and the driver is slow, the engine is useless. True power is not about how much space you occupy in the world. It is about how you move through it. As they spoke, a stray, heavy medicine ball, abandoned by a group of gymnasts a few yards away, caught a downward slope on the concrete and began rolling rapidly toward the crowd watching B. It was moving fast, heavy enough to break an ankle if it hit someone unexpectedly. Harrison braced himself, preparing to reach out and stop it. But before Harrison could even twitch his muscles, Bruce moved. It wasn't a large movement. It was a microscopic explosion of kinetic energy. Bruce shifted his weight, his right leg snapping out with a speed that the human eye simply could not track. His foot trapped the heavy leather medicine ball against the concrete with a sharp thwack. The ball stopped dead instantly, absorbing the exact, calculated amount of force required to halt its momentum without bouncing. Bruce then effortlessly flicked his ankle, popping the heavy ball straight up into his waiting hand. He placed it gently onto a nearby wooden bench and resumed walking, his hand slipping back into his pockets. The entire sequence took less than a second. A few people at the edge of B's crowd, including Tommy Russo, gasped. They hadn't just seen a man stop a ball, they had witnessed a localized defiance of physics. The sheer, blinding speed of the movement drew murmurs and whispers. The shift in the crowd's energy did not go unnoticed. B. Callahan, mid-rep, felt the eyes of her audience drift away. She heard the murmurs of awe directed not at her massive, straining biceps, but at a slight, skinny Chinese man in sunglasses walking away. A dark flush of anger crept up B's thick neck. In her world, disrespect was an unforgivable sin. She dropped the heavy barbell into the sand with a massive, earth-shaking thud. The iron plates rattled loudly. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with a chalky hand, her dark eyes locking onto the back of Bruce's white tank top. "Hey!" B's voice boomed over the crash of the ocean, deep and raspy. "Hey, you! The gymnast in the pajamas!" Bruce stopped. He didn't tense. He didn't look over his shoulder in a panic. He simply paused, taking a slow, deep breath of the salty air, and turned around with serene deliberation. Harrison tensed immediately, recognizing the danger. "Keep walking, Bruce," Harrison whispered urgently. "That's B. Callahan. She put a guy in the hospital last month just for looking at her weights wrong. Her boyfriend Sullivan is standing right there, and he's completely unhinged." "It is impolite to ignore someone when they call for you, Harry," Bruce said mildly. He stood perfectly still as the crowd parted like the Red Sea. B. Callahan marched toward them, her massive thighs churning up the sand. She looked like a freight train made of tanned muscle. Sullivan Brooks followed a few paces behind, a cruel, anticipatory smirk playing on his scarred lips. The giants of the sand were coming to crush an intruder, and the beach fell dead silent. B stopped 2 feet in front of Bruce. Up close, the size disparity was almost comical. She towered over him by 7 inches, her broad shoulders completely eclipsing the sun, casting Bruce in a dark, imposing shadow. Her chest heaved with adrenaline, her veins throbbing against her skin like angry, coiled snakes. Bruce slowly raised his hand and removed his tortoiseshell sunglasses, folding them neatly and hooking them onto the collar of his tank top. His dark eyes were tranquil, revealing absolutely zero fear. To B, who was used to men shrinking away in terror, this lack of intimidation was deeply insulting. "You like showing off, little man," B growled, crossing her massive arms over her chest. The muscles in her forearms twitched. "I was merely stopping the ball from striking your audience," Bruce replied politely, his tone devoid of sarcasm. "I meant no disrespect to your training." Sullivan Brooks stepped up beside B, cracking his thick knuckles. "He's calling you a liar, B. I saw him. He was trying to steal your crowd with some cheap parlor trick. Think you're tough, rice eater?" Harrison took a step forward, his fists clenching. "Back off, Sullivan. He just stopped a ball." Bruce held up a single index finger, gesturing for Harrison to stand down. Bruce's eyes remained fixed on B. He recognized the psychology at play. Beneath the 240 pounds of armored muscle, there was a fragile, desperate ego demanding validation. B leaned down, bringing her face inches from Bruce's. She smelled of chalk, sweat, and aggressive hostility. She looked him up and down, her eyes scanning his slender neck, his narrow waist, his lack of bulging, grotesque mass. A cruel, dismissive smile spread across her face. "I've squatted double your body weight for a warm-up," B sneered, her voice carrying so the entire beach could hear. "You're a twig. I look at you, and I don't see a man. I see a speed bump. You're tiny." The word hung in the air. Tiny. The crowd held its collective breath. Insulting a man's size was a deep psychological blow, especially in this environment. The bodybuilders snickered. Sullivan let out a harsh bark of laughter. Bruce did not flinch. He did not puff out his chest. Instead, a very faint, almost invisible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Size," Bruce said softly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with startling clarity, "is an illusion." B blinked, clearly thrown by the philosophical response. "What kind of fortune cookie garbage is that?" "A boulder is very large," Bruce explained patiently, as if speaking to a child. "It sits on the mountain, completely immovable. But if a small stream of water flows over that boulder for a long enough time, the water will carve the boulder into dust. You have built yourself into a boulder. You are rigid. You are bound by your own mass." B's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The philosophy went right over her head, but the condescending tone did not. Nobody lectured B. Callahan. "I'll show you rigid," B snarled. "I'm going to throw your skinny ass straight into the Pacific Ocean. Let's see your water tricks then." "B, don't!" Harrison warned, his voice tight. "You don't know who this is." "I don't care if he's the mayor of Los Angeles," she spat. She cracked her neck from side to side. "I'm going to grab him, press him over my head, and toss him." Bruce sighed, a quiet exhalation of disappointment. He slowly stepped back, shifting his feet into an imperceptible stance, a modified, relaxed version of his Jeet Kune Do base. His right heel slightly raised, his center of gravity dropping just a fraction of an inch. "You rely entirely on brute force," Bruce said, his eyes now locked onto her shoulders, reading the subtle twitches of her musculature that telegraphed her intentions. "But force without control is just a clumsy disaster waiting to happen. If you try to put your hands on me, you will humiliate yourself." Sullivan couldn't take it anymore. "Grab him, B. Break his collarbone." B let out a guttural roar, stepping forward with all 240 pounds of her body weight. She didn't throw a punch. She wasn't a fighter. She reached out with two massive claw-like hands, aiming to latch onto Bruce's shoulders, utilize her overwhelming leverage, and hoist him off the ground. It was an attack fueled by pure ego and catastrophic overconfidence. She expected a struggle. She expected resistance. She expected the tiny man to brace himself against her overwhelming power. Instead, Bruce simply spoke. As her hands lunged toward him, cutting through the air, Bruce's voice remained perfectly, chillingly calm. 7 seconds, Bruce whispered. The invisible clock started ticking. The invisible clock began its countdown the exact millisecond Beatrice Callahan's boots dug into the sand to launch her colossal frame forward. For the onlookers at Muscle Beach, the ensuing violence was a chaotic blur. But for Bruce Lee, time dilated. His mind, honed by thousands of hours of obsessive biomechanical study, broke the giantess's attack down into distinct, easily readable fractions of motion. Second one. B lunged. 240 pounds of dense, hypertrophied muscle propelled forward with the singular intent of crushing the small man in the white tank top. Her massive, chalk-dusted hands reached out like the jaws of a steel trap, aiming to seize Bruce by the shoulders and clavicle. Her form, however, was disastrously flawed. Driven by sheer rage and arrogance, her center of gravity was pitched too far forward. She was a runaway freight train, unstoppable in a straight line, but completely incapable of altering her course. Bruce did not retreat. He did not brace for impact. To meet force with force against a creature of B's size would be mathematical suicide. Instead, Bruce exhaled sharply and stepped forward, moving into the hurricane. Second 2. Contact was imminent, but it never arrived. In a display of footwork so fluid it looked like a camera trick, Bruce executed a precise lateral pivot. He slipped outside the perimeter of B's massive right arm. B's hands grasped nothing but the salty ocean air. The sudden lack of resistance shocked her nervous system. She had expected to hit a wall. Instead, she had plunged into a void, the momentum of her own 240 pounds, completely unchecked, began to pull her violently forward, throwing her entirely off balance. Second 3. Bruce moved from evasion to control. As B stumbled past him, carried by her own misdirected kinetic energy, Bruce's hands became a blur of intercepting strikes. He didn't punch her. Striking that much muscle mass without a clean opening was inefficient. Instead, his right hand snaked up and clamped around B's thick right wrist. His grip was not about crushing strength, but structural leverage. Simultaneously, his left hand shot out, the heel of his palm driving hard into the crook of her massive right elbow. Second 4. The trap was sprung. Bruce applied a hyper-specific, agonizing pressure to the radial nerve running down B's arm, while simultaneously pushing her elbow upward and pulling her wrist downward. It was a classic chin-na joint lock, amplified by Bruce's absolute mastery of anatomical physics. A jolt of electric, paralyzing pain shot straight from B's forearm into her brain. The giantess let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her massive bicep, capable of curling small cars, was rendered instantly useless because the joint it operated on was structurally compromised. Second 5. The true twist of the encounter revealed itself. B, operating on pure instinct, tried to muscle her way out of the lock. She planted her thick left leg, attempting to use her massive quadriceps to wrench her body upright and rip her arm free. Bruce had anticipated exactly this. He had not only read her movement, he was dictating it. As B's weight shifted to her left leg to stabilize herself, Bruce swept his own right leg in a tight, vicious arc. The back of his heel clipped the back of B's left knee, precisely at the hollow point where the tendons were stretched tightest. Second 6. The mathematics of gravity took over. B's stabilizing leg buckled instantly under her own immense weight. With her right arm locked in a tortuous fulcrum and her left leg completely swept out from under her, she was in a state of total, catastrophic freefall. But Bruce didn't want to injure her. He wanted to educate her. Just before B's face could smash violently into the wooden planks of the boardwalk, Bruce dropped his stance deeper, anchoring himself to the earth. With a terrifying display of tendon strength and core stability, he pulled upward on her trapped arm, acting as a human crane. He halted the downward acceleration of a 240-pound woman with one arm, stopping her descent mere inches from the ground. Second 7. The beach was engulfed in a deafening, stunned silence. Beatrice Callahan, the undisputed queen of Muscle Beach, was on her knees in the sand. Her massive frame was contorted awkwardly, entirely immobilized by a man 100 pounds lighter than her. The excruciating pain in her elbow was secondary to the absolute, shattering shock of her reality being rewritten in the span of a single breath. She could not move. She could not fight. She was entirely at the mercy of the tiny man. Tears of hot, furious humiliation stung her eyes. She looked up, her breathing ragged, expecting to see a sneer of triumph on Bruce's face. Instead, she saw only calm, steady tranquility. Bea choked out, her voice trembling, stripped of all its previous bass and bravado. The realization of her utter helplessness washed over her. The illusion of her invincibility had been permanently shattered. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You're not tiny. The silence stretching across the sun-baked expanse of Muscle Beach was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of talking. It was a physical weight, heavier and far more oppressive than any barbell resting on the sand. The rhythmic, crashing roar of the Pacific waves seemed to magnify the tension, each breaker sounding like a heavy gavel striking wood. 50 massive bodybuilders, powerlifters, and acrobats stood completely frozen in place, their mouths slightly agape, their breathing shallow and erratic. Tommy Russo, a man who regularly hoisted hundreds of pounds for the amusement of tourists, numbly dropped his lifting chalk. The white powder exploded into a small, pathetic cloud against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Sullivan Brooks, Bea's heavily scarred fiancé, stood rooted to the spot, his thick fists unclenched, his eyes bulging in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The woman he viewed as an unstoppable force of nature, a literal titan of the coastline, had been dismantled and brought to her knees without a single closed fist being thrown or a bead of sweat being broken. Bruce Lee held the agonizing joint lock for one more extended heartbeat, ensuring the lesson had truly taken root deep within her nervous system. He wasn't hurting her maliciously. He was holding a mirror up to her vulnerability. He felt the immense, aggressive fight drain entirely from Bea's massive musculature. The rigid tension in her arm dissolved into a trembling, terrified surrender. Gently, almost delicately, as if placing a fragile teacup back onto its saucer, Bruce released her thick wrist and stepped back. He didn't posture. He didn't puff out his chest or look around at the awe-struck crowd to soak in their astonishment. His breathing was completely even, his pulse unchanged. Bea remained on her knees in the hot sand for a long moment. She brought her massive left hand over to clutch her right elbow, rubbing the bruised skin where Bruce's slender fingers had felt like hydraulic iron clamps. She stared down at the grains of sand clinging to her sweat-drenched knees, her broad chest heaving as her mind desperately tried to process the impossible physics of what had just occurred. Everything she knew about power, about dominance, about the absolute necessity of being the biggest person in the room had just evaporated into thin air. Tears of hot, furious humiliation stung the corners of her eyes, blurring her vision. She looked up, her breathing ragged, half expecting to see a sneer of arrogant triumph on the small man's face. Instead, she saw only calm, steady tranquility. "How?" she whispered. The word barely carried over the ocean breeze, stripped of all its previous bass and bravado. She looked up at Bruce, her dark eyes wide, with a potent mixture of residual fear and a profound, reluctant reverence. "You didn't even push me. You didn't strike me. I fell into you. I couldn't stop." Bruce reached down, offering his open hand to the giantess. Bea hesitated, staring at his small, calloused palm as if it were a loaded weapon. Slowly, swallowing the last fragments of her shattered pride, she reached out her own massive, chalk-caked hand and let him help her to her feet. Despite the staggering size difference, His grip was as solid and unyielding as bedrock. He pulled her upright with an effortless grace that further defied logic. "You defeated yourself, Beatrice," Bruce said, his voice returning to its mild, philosophical cadence. He reached up and calmly adjusted the collar of his crisp white tank top. "You poured all of your strength into a single, rigid direction. You treated your body like a battering ram, assuming the sheer weight of it would break any barrier. But what happens to a heavy battering ram when the castle gate is suddenly opened instead of locked?" Bea blinked, her brow furrowing, as the analogy slowly sank into her consciousness. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, searching curiosity. It crashes into the empty courtyard," she murmured, picturing the violent, uncontrolled momentum. "It falls." "Exactly," Bruce nodded, a faint, encouraging smile touching his lips. "I did not overpower you. I simply opened the gate. I allowed your own anger, your own velocity, and your own mass to do the work for me. Muscle is a beautiful thing, Beatrice. It is the armor of the body, and you have built formidable armor. But if the mind is stiff, the armor becomes a heavy prison. To be a true martial artist, to be truly strong in this world, you must be like water." The profound moment of teaching was abruptly shattered. Sullivan Brooks finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. His heavily scarred face contorted into a grotesque mask of embarrassed rage. His fiancée had just been humiliated in front of their entire court, which meant, by the primitive laws of the beach, his own alpha status was critically threatened. With a guttural yell that tore through his throat, Sullivan lowered his head like a charging bull and launched himself at Bruce, his thick, heavily tattooed arms swinging wildly in wide, uncoordinated haymakers. "Sullivan, no!" Bea screamed, her voice cracking as she reached out to stop him. But she was a fraction of a second too late. Harrison Miller flinched violently, raising his arms to shield his face, but Bruce didn't even turn his head fully to acknowledge the incoming threat. His peripheral vision had already calculated the trajectory, the speed, and the clumsiness of the heavyweight boxer. As the 280-pound man closed the final few feet, Bruce simply shifted his weight and lifted his lead leg. He executed a lightning-fast, perfectly timed jeet tech, an intercepting oblique kick. It was a masterpiece of economic motion. Bruce's heel shot out and struck Sullivan squarely just above his left knee. It wasn't a devastating, bone-breaking blow meant to permanently cripple. It was a perfectly calibrated structural check. The sudden hyperextension jammed Sullivan's leg violently backward, completely short-circuiting his forward momentum and collapsing his foundation. Sullivan let out a sharp yelp of surprise and sudden, agonizing pain, stumbling awkwardly to the side like a felled timber. He collapsed heavily onto a nearby wooden bench, clutching his throbbing knee in absolute shock. The fight instantly drained from him. The entire violent exchange took less than a single second. Bruce smoothly lowered his leg, returning to his relaxed stance, turning his attention back to Bea as if the interruption hadn't even happened. He didn't even spare a glance at the groaning boxer on the bench. "Strength without flexibility is a tragedy," Bruce told her quietly, his tone intimate, ensuring only she could hear this final, vital piece of advice over the murmurs of the awestruck crowd. "Do not let your size become your only identity. Learn to flow. Learn to yield when the situation demands it. Then, and only then, your power will truly be limitless." Bea Callahan, the former terror of Muscle Beach, stood tall, but her posture had changed entirely. Her broad shoulders dropped in a strange, newfound posture of genuine humility. She looked at Bruce, truly seeing him for the first time, and slowly bowed her head, a deep and unprompted gesture of ultimate respect. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying a weight far heavier than any barbell she had ever lifted. Bruce nodded graciously in return. He retrieved his tortoise-shell sunglasses from where they hung on his collar, slid them smoothly back onto his face to shield his eyes from the harsh California glare, and turned to his companion. "Shall we continue our walk, Harry?" Bruce asked, casually slipping his hands back into his pockets. "I believe there is a wonderful dim sum restaurant a few miles down the coast." Harrison, still staring wide-eyed at the subdued giants and the groaning Sullivan, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He scrambled to catch up with his friend. Yeah, Bruce. Dim sum sounds great." As the two men walked away, their silhouettes shrinking into the hazy, golden California sunshine, the crowd at Muscle Beach slowly began to breathe again. Nobody moved to pick up a dropped weight. Nobody cheered or whispered. They simply stood in the sand and watched the slight, unassuming figure in the white tank top vanish into the distance, fully aware that they had just witnessed a revolution in human movement. The undisputed reign of pure mass had ended. The era of velocity had begun. The incident at Muscle Beach became a whispered legend among the Iron Elite. It wasn't merely a physical defeat. It was a profound paradigm shift. Beatrice Callahan never bullied another soul, trading her previous arrogance for a quiet, disciplined humility. Bruce Lee proved that day that true power doesn't roar from a mountain of static muscle. True power flows freely like water, silent, totally adaptable, and ultimately impossible to break.